Now, a warning that this next part of the show does contain references to mental health and suicide that some people may find upsetting or triggering. According to the World Health Organization, more than 700,000 people commit suicide each year. That's a staggering one person every 40 seconds. And of these people, 115 deaths every week in the UK are as a result of suicide, with 75% of those being male. But how much is being done to tackle the rates of male suicide and to those who need support through suicidal thoughts? Well, back in 2021, Steve Whittle, an accountant from Hucknall, attempted suicide himself after suffering from prolonged mental health issues. Thankfully, Steve survived, and he now works to break the stigma of male suicide and getting us all to talk about and ultimately to prevent it. And it's all through his charity, Tough to Talk. Steve joins me in the studio now. Steve, thank you so much for joining us
No worries, thanks for having me.
Let's start with a bit about your story, if you don't mind.
Yeah, well, I'm 50 now, and when I was 49, I got finally diagnosed with depression, which came from chronic PTSD. And chronic PTSD means that you've had a series of traumas in your life. So something happened to me when I was a teenager, and I was in a really masculine area, you know, and growing up. So I just buried it deep and didn't deal with it. Same thing happened again when I was in the forces, and then something later in life. And my environment was of such that, you know, you just couldn't talk about those kind of things, so you just bury it. And then I started to become mentally ill, and I became very depressed, started having problems with anxiety. And, you know, eventually the only way I could see to get out of it was to, you know, I had suicide behaviours, and I, you know, attempted to take my life. And
do you think anyone knew how much you were suffering?
No, not at all. It's, you just don't talk about it, you know. I mean, the problem is that when you attempt and you fail, you feel even worse. You know, like, you know, the one thing I have control over is whether I live or die, and I couldn't even do that. Well, I mean, what a loser, you know. That's how you feel. So you say, well, I'm not going to let anybody else know that, because no one's talking about it, so you don't think it's acceptable to tell people.
Now, this is where it gets interesting in terms of you sort of forget maybe that people then have to go back to real life. You had some time off work, and then when you went back to work, rather than again burying those feelings and not talking about what had happened, you took a slightly different approach.
Yeah, so I mean, I'm very lucky. So I work for Cooper Parry, who are a fantastic organisation. So they really are people first. So it's not a lip service where they wheel people out for 1 week a year. They do it all year round. And my boss was amazing, and she recognised my work was suffering, and she saw warning signs, and she took me to one side, and I thought, this is it, I'm getting canned. I knew it, and I already started to explain to her, look, I'm really sorry, I get things back on track, I'm not right. And she said, I couldn't care less about work.
Wow.
I know, I care about you, what's going on. And it was like one of the first people who's ever asked me, and I just blurted it out to her. And she must have been astounded, because at that point I hadn't told my girlfriend, I hadn't told anybody, and she knew exactly what to do. And she just said, it's okay, forget work, we're going to get you help. And I was like, wow, that's unbelievable.
And what was the reaction like from your colleagues at work?
Well, they were just more upset that they didn't know. You know, they felt helpless, which is not what what I was expecting. I was expecting them, you know, pull yourself together. You know, all our lives, most men have been told, man up,
yeah.
Be stoic, don't cry, suck it up, yeah. And but that wasn't the response I got, and it was difficult to deal with, because you was like, oh, maybe this is just too much sympathy, and people feel sorry for me,
yeah.
And then you have to deal with that as well.
And there's thankfully a big focus now on trying to support people with mental health, especially at work. Do you think workplaces can do more, should do more?
Well, I think that, you know, you spend a third of your life at work, and so if you can create an amazing culture at work that deals with, you know, especially men's issues, then that will filter out into the rest of society, and then it will filter into their children as they're growing up, because it becomes normal to be able to engage about these subjects.
And it is one of those things, and it's so stereotypical to say it, but in terms of men talking about their feelings, they generally don't. So following your experience of going back to work, you founded the male suicide prevention charity Tough to Talk. Tell us about how that's helping men.
Absolutely. So we know that you know all the talk about patriarchy, the gender bias, toxic masculinity, it all gets thrown into the air a lot. It gets a lot of airtime, and it often focuses purely on how it affects women. But actually, it's killing men because they're not talking about.
I mean, those stats are wild.
It's crazy. I mean, so it's one suicide every 40 seconds, and a third of those are men. That's it's just crazy. But what's another alarming stat is the highest stat I could find for this, and because it ranges, is 36% of men are reaching out to get psychiatric help. Well, that's it. So you've got that, you've got 2/3 of men who are not even reaching out for help because they don't feel like they can. And all these services that are out there right now, and there's loads, so men can get help if they want it, but they choose not to. And often that content is, the colours are very, flowery, very feminine. Tone of voice is not very good. I mean, you start talking to men about being vulnerable and everything else like that, they don't approach it. And the other issue is, you're putting the blame at the victim's door. You need to talk more. You need to sort this out. Well, if you're in a work environment which is very masculine, and they say, well, there's an open door policy, I'm not going to walk through the door because they're going to think everybody else behind them's after their job or going to get where they're going to go, or you're going to tell your boss, and then your boss is going to say, well, we've got this nice project coming up, but I better not give it to you because you're not in a great place.
Steve, I'm so sorry, I'm going to have to stop you there. We can talk about this a lot. Thank you so much for coming and sharing your story with us. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
And just to follow on from what you've heard from Steve there, if you are going through something and you do want to speak to someone about it, you can call the Samaritans anytime on the number on screen right now. It's 116 123. They are incredible. You can also email joe@samaritans.org. That's jo@samaritans.org.